Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting proposal that's been getting quite a lot of attention.
Yeah, this idea of swapping out the federal income tax, like completely, and
Yeah,
using tariffs on imported goods instead.
exactly. It's a concept that sort of pulls on threads from way back in U.S. economic history, but definitely bumps up against some pretty significant modern day realities.
Right. And we really want to explore who might actually end up paying these tariffs, and what the bigger picture consequences could be for you, the listener.
hmm So to get a solid grip on this, we've gathered a bunch of different perspectives. We're looking at analyses from places like the Tax Foundation,
The
AEI.
American Enterprise Institute, yeah,
Yeah.
and the Progressive Policy Institute, CEPR, too.
Right, the Center for Economic Policy Research. Plus, we've checked out news coverage like from Fox News and even some of the chatter happening on Reddit just to see what different folks are thinking.
So our mission, especially for you, the learner, is to really unpack this idea, try to separate what's solid from maybe what's less so.
And reveal the potential economic impacts, the surprising stuff, and the more straightforward things without, hopefully, drowning you in jargon.
We want to equip you with a clear sense of the core arguments and, well, the economic facts on the ground.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The basic idea, and it's been talked about recently by former President Trump, is this possibility of getting rid of the federal income tax. Maybe entirely.
And replacing it with tariffs on stuff we import. He's also mentioned other ideas alongside this, hasn't he? Like eliminating taxes on tip income.
Yeah, tips, and also maybe lowering the corporate tax rate even further.
But the big one is this income tax for tariff swap. And what's fascinating, as you mentioned, is that this isn't entirely out of left field, historically speaking.
Not at all. If you look way back at how the U.S. government used to fund itself, tariffs were basically the main game in town.
Especially before we got the income tax, which was, what, 1913?
That's right. I was reading that from like 1790 to 1860. Tariffs were the big breadwinner, bringing in something like 90% of all federal revenue.
90%. Wow.
Yeah. And even between 1860 and 1913, they still accounted for about half.
Okay, but here's the kicker when you think about applying that idea today. The sheer size of government spending now compared to back then.
Oh, absolutely. That's a critical point. In 2023, federal spending was around 22.7% of GDP.
Whereas back when tariffs were the main source, government
Yeah.
spending was just tiny, barely breaking 2% of GDP sometimes.
Exactly. So the scale of the challenge, funding today's government versus funding that government, it's just dramatically different.
Which really sets the stage for the, let's call it the revenue math problem.
Yeah, the math. Okay, so the individual income tax alone brought in a massive $2.2 trillion in 2021.
2.2 trillion. Okay.
Now, compare that to the total tariff revenue on goods in that same year. It was only $80 billion.
80 billion versus 2.2 trillion. Okay.
Right.
And the average tariff rate was pretty low then, right? Like under 3%?
Yeah, 2.9% on average, whereas the average income tax rate was much higher, around 14.9%, and on a way bigger base, $15 trillion of income versus like $2.8 trillion of goods imports.
So the gap we're talking about filling is just enormous.
Huge. The Tax Foundation's analysis really hammers this home, the immense mathematical hurdle here.
Did they try to calculate what kind of tariff rate you'd actually need?
They did, and it's pretty eye-popping. To seemingly replace the income tax revenue based on 2023 import levels, you'd need an across-the-board tariff hike of nearly 70%.
70. Wow. On everything imported.
Basically, yeah. But, and this is a huge but, they point out that's a seriously oversimplified calculation.
Right, because that assumes, well, it assumes a lot of things that probably wouldn't happen in reality.
Exactly. Like, first off, it doesn't account for noncompliance. People or companies not paying what they owe.
Which always happens with any tax, so if you factor that in.
Well, they estimate maybe a 15% noncompliance rate, which could drop that potential revenue down significantly, maybe to around $1.8 trillion. Still short.
Okay, still short. And then there's a really big one. How people and businesses react.
Right. If you slap a nearly 70% tax on imported goods, are people just going to keep buying the same amount? Probably not.
Prices would go way up. So people would likely buy less imported stuff or maybe find domestic alternatives if they exist.
Precisely. The Tax Foundation talks about the elasticity, how much import demand changes when prices change. They use a figure, nettish 0.997%.
Which basically means if the price goes up 10%, imports drop by almost 10%.
Pretty much, yeah. And when you factor that behavioral response into the calculation, the potential revenue just plummets.
How far down?
Down to maybe $560 billion.
Okay, wait. From a target of over $2 trillion down to maybe $560 billion once you account for people buying less.
Yeah. I mean, to put that $560 billion in perspective for you, the learner, that's less than the annual budget for the Department of Defense.
Wow, so it really highlights how far short this falls in purely mathematical terms, doesn't it?
It really does.
And what's interesting here is that other analyses seem to back this up. The Center for Economic Policy Research, the CEPR, they use their big global economic model.
What did they find?
Very similar conclusions, actually. They suggested that even with really significant tariff increases, the maximum additional government revenue you could realistically expect would likely be less than $500 billion a year.
Less than $500 billion. And when you think that current federal spending is projected to be around, what, $6.8 trillion for 2024?
Yeah, that extra $500 billion, while not nothing, doesn't go very far at all. It would only fund the government for a few weeks.
Something like that.
And the CEPR analysis also pointed out this kind of fundamental conflict, didn't it?
You mean between raising revenue and reducing the trade deficit?
Exactly. Proponents often say tariffs will do both. But the CEPR model shows, logically, the more successful tariffs are at reducing imports.
The less stuff there is coming in to collect tariffs on.
Precisely. It shrinks the tax base. So you can't really maximize both goals at the same time. It's a bit of a catch-22.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it seems the basic promise of replacing the income tax with tariffs hits some major roadblocks just on the numbers alone.
The math is tough.
Definitely. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about who actually pays these tariffs when they're imposed. It's not the companies in China or Mexico sending the goods, right?
That's a really common misunderstanding. But no. When the U.S. government imposes a tariff, the legal responsibility for paying that tax falls on the U.S. entity, the person or the business that's importing the good.
So the American company bringing in the parts or the finished products pays the tariff bill to Uncle Sam.
Correct. And the evidence we have, especially from studies looking at the 2018-2019 tariffs, is pretty clear on this.
What did they find?
They found that nearly 100% of the cost of those tariffs was passed on to the U.S. importers. The foreign exporters didn't really lower their prices to absorb the tariff.
Okay, so the U.S. importer pays, which means those costs are very likely then passed further down the chain.
Almost certainly. Passed on to other U.S. businesses if the imports are parts or materials, and ultimately passed on to us, the American consumers, through higher prices for all sorts of goods.
Right. We end up paying for it at the checkout counter.
And this can have a really significant and generally negative impact on the overall economy. The American Enterprise Institute, AEI, makes this point quite strongly.
How so?
Well, think about it. When prices go up both for businesses buying imported components and for consumers buying finished goods, it essentially reduces the real value of what people earn. Your paycheck doesn't go as far.
Right, your purchasing power decreases.
Exactly, and AEI argues that this can then lead to less incentive to work and invest. If the rewards for working and investing are effectively lower because of higher prices, people might do less of both.
Which ultimately slows down economic growth.
That's the concern. It could potentially lead to lower overall economic output in the long run.
AEI also raised a really interesting point about the value of the U.S. dollar, something I hadn't really considered.
Oh, the currency appreciation effect. Yeah, that's important.
They suggest tariffs could actually cause the dollar to become stronger relative to other currencies. How does that work?
Well, the thinking is, if tariffs reduce demand for imports, then Americans need less foreign currency to buy those imports. Less demand for foreign currency means the relative value of the dollar could rise.
Okay, so a stronger dollar might make imports cheaper in dollar terms, maybe offsetting some of the tariff's price hike.
Potentially, yes, it could cushion the blow slightly on the import side. But, and this is the big but, a stronger dollar has a major downside for American companies that export goods.
Ah, right, because if the dollar is stronger,
then U.S.-made goods become more expensive for people in other countries to buy.
Making it harder for our exporters to compete in the global market.
Exactly, which can lead to lower sales for them, reduced revenues, and potentially lower incomes or even job losses for people working in those export-oriented sectors like agriculture or manufacturing for export.
So even if some domestic industries hope to benefit from tariffs on competing imports,
those potential gains could easily be outweighed by these broader negative consequences, like harm to exporters and the general drag from higher prices.
I remember seeing, I think it was the Tax Foundation analysis, mentioning that economists who studied those 2018-2019 tariffs actually found a net decrease in U.S. manufacturing employment.
That's right. When they accounted for both the benefits to protected industries and the costs from higher input prices and retaliatory tariffs from other countries, the net effect on manufacturing jobs was negative.
That seems like a pretty significant finding, maybe counterintuitive for some people.
It really highlights how interconnected the modern economy is, Policies can have these ripple effects that aren't immediately obvious.
Okay, so that's the impact on consumers and businesses. Now, let's think about tariffs themselves, just as a way of taxing the economy. How do economists view them?
Well, from a supply-side economics perspective, which generally favors lower taxes to boost production, tariffs are basically seen as a tax on international trade, on transactions.
And historically, supply-siders haven't been big fans of tariffs, have they?
Generally, no. The AEI piece we looked at even called it super weird for conservative supply-siders to be embracing tariffs now.
Why weird?
Because the traditional supply-side view, folks like Jude Wanniski back in the day, saw tariffs as harmful. They believed tariffs distort markets, raise prices for consumers, and ultimately hinder economic growth, much like other taxes they opposed. They often point to Smoot-Hawley in the 30s.
The infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, often blamed for worsening the Great Depression, though I know the actual causes are debated.
Right. But the supply-side argument is that tariffs are generally bad for growth. Now, beyond that specific school of thought, there are other criticisms of tariffs as a tax mechanism.
Like what?
The Progressive Policy Institute, PPI, raised some strong points here. They argue that tariffs are actually a pretty poor form of taxation, for several reasons. One big one is transparency.
Meaning it's hard to see how much you're actually paying?
Exactly. Compared to an income tax where you see the deduction on your pay stub, or even a sales tax listed on your receipt, tariffs are kind of hidden within the price of goods.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, who really knows what the current tariff rate is on, imported shoes or electronics or furniture? It's buried in the final price.
It's incredibly complex. The U.S. harmonized tariff schedule has, thousands and thousands of different lines and rates. It makes it almost impossible for the average person, for you, to figure out how much tariffs are adding to the cost of things.
So, less transparent. What else did PPI mention?
They also stress that tariffs tend to be regressive.
Meaning they hit lower-income people harder.
Disproportionately, yes. Lower-income families typically spend a larger percentage of their income on basic goods, things like clothing, food, household necessities, many of which are imported or contain imported components subject to tariffs.
So the tariff burden as a share of their income is higher than for wealthier families.
That's the argument. And PPI also noted that this regressivity can actually worsen over time through lobbying. Industries producing, say, luxury goods might successfully lobby for lower tariff rates, while industries producing basic necessities might face less pressure, or even lobby for protection, potentially leading to higher effective rates on the things lower-income families buy most.
Interesting. Okay, and let's not forget the whole trade balance issue. That often comes up as a primary reason for tariffs to fix the trade deficit.
Right, but the AEI analysis, and frankly most mainstream economics, is pretty clear on this. Tariffs don't directly affect the overall trade deficit in the long run.
They don't. Why not?
Because the overall trade deficit, or surplus, is fundamentally driven by macroeconomic factors, specifically the balance between a country's total savings and total investment. It reflects net international borrowing or lending.
So tariffs don't change that fundamental saving-investment balance?
Not directly, no. What tariffs do is reduce the overall volume of trade. They reduce imports, sure, but eventually, through mechanisms like currency appreciation or retaliation, they tend to reduce exports too.
So less trade overall, but the net balance doesn't necessarily change much.
Exactly. Tariffs might shift bilateral trade balances, like maybe we buy less from China and more from Vietnam, but the total U.S. trade deficit with the world remains largely determined by those bigger saving and investment flows.
Okay. And we touched on this earlier, but that potential for the U.S. dollar to get stronger is a key part of the story, too.
A very key part. Because while, yes, it might soften the direct price hit from tariffs on imports,
it simultaneously creates that disadvantage for our exporters trying to sell their goods overseas. Hurts farmers, manufacturers selling abroad.
Precisely. It's a double-edged sword.
So thinking about the overall impact on government revenue again, we talked about the direct tariff collection falling short. But are there other sort of knock-on effects on revenue?
Yes, absolutely. AEI highlighted this as well. Even the revenue you do collect from tariffs can be partially offset by other factors.
Like the behavioral changes we discussed. People buying less tariffed stuff.
It's exactly. Or trade diversion businesses finding ways to source goods from countries not subject to the tariffs. Both of those shrink the base of goods you can actually apply the tariff to, lowering the collected revenue below initial projections.
Okay. And they also mentioned something called the excise tax offset. That sounds a bit technical. Could you break that down?
Sure. Think of it this way. Tariffs act like an excise tax, raising prices. If tariffs lead to higher overall prices and maybe somewhat lower economic activity, people's real incomes might effectively fall, or at least not grow as fast.
Okay, makes sense.
When people's real incomes are lower, the government naturally collects less revenue from other taxes that depend on income, primarily income taxes and payroll taxes.
Ah, I see. So the gain from the tariff revenue could be partially canceled out by a loss in income and payroll tax revenue.
Exactly. It's like a hidden fiscal cost.
Yeah.
The government gives with one hand, tariff revenue, but takes away with the other.
Yeah.
Lower revenue from other taxes.
So the net gain in federal revenue from slapping on big tariffs might actually be quite a bit smaller than the gross tariff figure you'd initially calculate.
That's the conclusion many economists reach, yeah. The Tax Foundation, for instance, ran a simulation. They estimated that even a hypothetical 10% across-the-board tariff.
Which is way less than the 70% needed to replace the income tax.
Right. Even that 10% tariff, while it would significantly increase the gross amount of tariff revenue collected, the net increase in overall federal revenue would likely be much smaller.
Why smaller?
Because you have to account for those offsets, the lower income and payroll tax collections, and also the potential for a long-term reduction in the size of the overall economy due to the negative effects of the tariffs. They estimated maybe a 0.4% smaller economy in the long run from just a 10% tariff.
Wow. So finally, let's just circle back quickly to who ends up feeling the pinch the most, the distributional effects. We said tariffs tend to be regressive.
Yes, hitting lower income households harder as a percentage of their income.
And AEI seemed to concur with that overall assessment.
They did. They noted that while there might be some complicated short-term effects on wealth, perhaps due to that currency appreciation we talked about, which could theoretically be progressive, the primary impact felt by most people is through consumption.
Through the higher prices they pay.
Right. And that consumption-based impact is generally considered regressive, disproportionately affecting those with lower incomes who spend a larger share of their budget on basic, often imported or import-competing goods.
Okay, so let's try and sum up this deep dive then. This idea of replacing the federal income tax with tariffs. It's really complex, isn't it?
Definitely not simple. And it seems to face some very significant economic and, frankly, practical challenges.
The basic math, just replacing the revenue, looks incredibly difficult, maybe impossible without massive, economically damaging tariff rates.
Right. And the historical context, while interesting, involved a government that was just vastly smaller than today's. The scale is completely different.
And the likely impacts on consumers through higher prices, on businesses through import costs and export difficulties, they seem substantial and, according to most of the analyses we looked at, largely negative for the overall economy.
Yeah, it doesn't really appear to be a straightforward or economically efficient solution for tax reform or for generating the kind of revenue the U.S. government currently requires.
Absolutely. Which kind of leads to a final thought, maybe something provocative for you, the learner, to consider.
Okay.
Given this deep history of the U.S. relying on tariffs and the fact that this debate keeps resurfacing, what does that tell us about the enduring appeal of certain economic tools or ideas, even when modern analysis suggests they might not work as intended today?
That's interesting. Like, why does the idea persist?
Yeah. And are there maybe specific, very targeted circumstances where tariffs could be more justifiable than trying this kind of huge, broad replacement of a major tax system like the income tax?
That's a great question to ponder. We definitely encourage you to maybe delve deeper into that long history of U.S. tariff policy and really think critically about the arguments for and against different ways of funding our modern, very complex economy.
Some real food for thought there. Thanks for exploring this deep dive with us.